is, so climate change, as I mentioned on last week's program, is here. We are stuck with climate change. There are lots of reports saying that the climate catastrophes that we are seeing, whether it's flooding, earthquakes, hurricanes, tsunamis, and other types of things will become more normal. Forest fires in places we never expected forest fires to be in, that's going to continue to happen. So, I talked a little bit last week about how we proceed. I want to take a step back this week and talk about climate change from a slightly different perspective, which is to say that climate change is going to be the new force of inequity and inequality in the world. And one of the reasons I want to talk about this is because I'm not sure there are a ton of people talking about it in general, but it is a really important topic, and I'm hoping that by kind of delving into it a little bit, I can get you to understand why it's not just, a dangerous thing for us generally, but it has these global impacts in ways that, will continue to perpetuate the inequities and the inequalities that we already see in our world, right? So the most obvious iteration of this is going to be that many of the countries who are not in the developed world are the ones who are bearing the brunt of climate change going on. Now, obviously, in the developed world, we are experiencing climate change. That is not, this is not to say that it only affects those in the underdeveloped world. But if you think about it, in the developed world, we are likely to have the ability to mitigate some of the harm, whether it's to build levees quickly or to have the resources to move people out of dangerous areas and not to disrupt people's lives too much more than they already have been. But if you think about the underdeveloped world, not only are there not necessarily national resources there, but a lot of these countries are not necessarily as politically and economically stable as some of the developed world is, and that leads to a variety of issues, including the inability to formulate a holistic response to any climate disaster. So specifically, I'm talking about South Sudan right now. So they had a bunch of flooding in the last couple of weeks. I mentioned it last week on the show. And, people essentially were not able to rely on their local governments or even their national government to get them help because there just wasn't a level of organization there. There wasn't a level of excess resources there to be mobilized. So compare this, where lots of people are just trying to kind of salvage things on their own and they're trying to deal with this on their own, with what's happening in Germany and Belgium right now. So when these floods came through Germany and Belgium, the entirety of Germany's police force, national police force, was mobilized, their military was mobilized, there were helicopters and military vehicles and resources brought from all over Germany and concentrated in these areas to either help rescue people, to get rid of to pump out the water, to try and save people's valuables, to try and save people's homes, and just to perform these kind of damage mitigation procedures that would have helped the people who were affected, right? And Belgium, the same thing. Huge amounts of resources were organized. And by the way, this is because these countries have stable governments and they have excess resources. Now, of course, if you think about this from a historical perspective, it kind of makes sense why this is the case, right? Countries in the developed world have often been the exploiters of countries in the underdeveloped world, right? And that exploitation has taken the resources that were naturally there, has destabilized the institutions that were naturally there, and transferred all of that wealth and stability over to what we now know as the developed world, right? This is kind of the fallout of colonialism, imperialism, and kind of all the other bad isms that occurred between like the 1600s and 1600s and like 2000s, if we're being real. And some of this exploitation still goes on, right? But so so that was a huge driver of inequality because it creates these situations where some countries have a lot more wealth than others. And when there are catastrophes, and again, as I said earlier, these catastrophes are not just affecting one part of the world or another part of the world. These catastrophes are affecting us all over the world, developed, underdeveloped, semi-developed, whatever. But at the end of the day, those countries who have more resources, who are able to invest more resources in prevention, who are able to invest more resources in risk remediation, once they have actually had the disaster and resettle people and what have you, those countries are going to be much better off, and those people who live in those countries will be much better off than in a country like South Sudan, where Al Jazeera had interviewed a woman whose house had effectively floated away, and she was just desperately trying to get out whatever she could, but there was no large mobilization of resources there. Now, that may have changed since that interview, but at the time, it was difficult because, the whole town was essentially washed away, and there wasn't much that the surrounding area was able to do because the resources simply weren't there. And this is occurring all over the place. In China, when there was flooding, there was lots of resources available, right? When there was, major flooding in the United States, and although Katrina was more or less botched, there were lots of resources that were able to be mobilized, right? People were able to come in. And so essentially the point I'm trying to make here is that it used to be that exploitation and colonialism and imperialism were the forms of inequalities, were the root causes of iniquities between nation states. And although that holds true, climate change is going to make it worse, because for every disaster that climate change wreaks on underdeveloped nations, they will become further underdeveloped, right? Any progress that they made in their development will be hampered. Whereas in the developed world, we will have the resources available to actually not allow ourselves on a large scale to become, to kind of lose our developed status through, as these disasters roll on. So I think it's just important to think about from an economic and historical perspective about what is going on as far as climate change's effects on other countries, what we're benefiting from, right? We obviously understand our place in history as benefiting from the cruelties of the past. Even if you had nothing to do with the exploitation, you are benefiting from it, right? If you're in a developed country. So this is just one of the things we have to think about when we advocate for preventative measures in developed countries. We're not necessarily doing it for ourselves entirely. We're also doing it for our brethren in other countries for whom we have already robbed of the ability to do prevention, right? We are fighting to make sure that, we're reducing the impact of climate change, not because necessarily it will help us, and it will, mind you, but also, and more importantly, because it's going to help those people for whom we have taken away the ability to do the preventative measures on their own.